and outrageous opportunities and precarious paradigms and shameless stupidity in wearable assistive technology. Karl's from Vanderbilt University, and we'd like to invite you to stay for the follow-up session to this that complements Karl's talk called Refreshing Perspectives on Assistive Technology. And then after that, let's keep the momentum going on this topic throughout the day today. We have a social hour this evening titled Wearable Assistive and Rehabilitation Technology Social Hour at National on 10th from 6 to 8 p.m. You can find it in the ISB app on your phone. Okay, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Karl Zelik.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Turn the mic on here. Elizabeth, thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me in the back? Good? Good at that end? Awesome. All right, thank you all for coming out to the early session. I know it's not easy. I'm looking out at you. About half of you look hungover. Yeah, a couple of you look like you come straight from the bar. So if you need to stretch your legs, if you need some coffee, if you need to brush your teeth, do what you gotta do. So in honor of that, in honor of the folks that came straight from the bar, I want to start off by talking about beer. So I've noticed lately when I go to the grocery store, I can half the time not even find the milk or the bread, but there's aisle after aisle of beers in these grocery stores. And all around town, if Calgary's anything like Nashville, there are just microbreweries popping up left and right. A buddy of mine actually owns one of these microbreweries in my neighborhood. And I started asking him a few months ago if he was concerned if the market was growing too quickly. And how are you going to keep stocking your beer on these shelves? These microbreweries are local. They're not selling at a global level. So how do you keep competing? I said, are you going to hire some more salespeople? Are you going to start a marketing campaign? And he thought for a second. He said, no, I don't think I'm going to do any of that. I think it'll be fine. I'll just hire some more goats. I thought, what the heck is this guy talking about? Hire some more goats. He's like, no, don't worry about it. They're yoga goats, but minus the yoga. And so I was kind of bummed at first because I liked this microbrewery and I figured it was going out of business. But he told me, he was like, no, you've got this wrong. You're thinking of this too simplistically. He was like, there's one way that microbreweries make money, which is by selling large volumes of their beer to restaurants, to grocery stores. But the problem is, when you sell a keg of beer, you sell it through a distributor, and you only sell it for about $100, so there's really low margins, so you have to drive up really high volume in order to make money. And he said the other way you can make money, and a lot of microbreweries do this, is that you get people to come to your tap room, and you can sell your own product at a higher rate, so you don't have to sell as much, but you have much higher margins. And it makes perfect sense. It's a really simple idea, but I've been walking through so many grocery stores, I wasn't thinking in that mindset. And so once I heard this, I realized the brilliance of goats. So why are goats a good way to sell beer? People like goats, but more importantly, kids like goats, and parents like beer. So he brings in these yoga goats. This is actually a picture of my daughter trying to mouth kiss the goat. And we drop off our kids out into the back area with the goats. The parents hang out up on the patio, watching the kids, having some beers, having adult conversation, and it is a brilliant innovation. I tried to go to this brewery a week ago, showed up, parking lot is absolutely full, I couldn't get in, and it was because they were having the goat night. And so I like this. This is kind of part of what got me into science, is this idea that you can start to think about a problem a different way, and it leads you to different innovations, to different solutions. Something sparks your curiosity. Something causes you to rethink what you once knew. It can be really obvious, but the moment that you see, oh, I can think about this problem differently, it can lead to some cool solutions. Okay, so this next video is a little bit grainy, but I absolutely love it. It's well worth it. Yeah, so this kid's probably kicked a bunch of rocks in his lifetime. He had built up this mental model of what happens when you kick a rock, and something completely different happened, right? And I think this is kind of a metaphor for the spark that we get in science when we realize something doesn't make sense, an experiment goes a way that we did not expect. But then we often come out to these conferences, we read in publications, And science is often told in a way that's meant to be really clear and concise, and it's kind of in a sterilized manner, not necessarily the way it unfolds. We show up to the session, somebody has this beautiful background to their research, all the literature is cited, they have this very clear hypothesis and problem statement, they present really compelling, well thought out methods, the results are amazing, and there's this really thoughtful discussion. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit more of how I've seen science unfold, and often it's a bit like kicking that rock. Something happens, it sparks your curiosity, and as scientists, we kick the rock. We're not upset when we get up. We look back and think, what the heck happened? I want to understand what went wrong. I had this model and something else happened. And I feel like we're often immediately thrown into this state of chaos and confusion, and I like this. I think this is part of our job. This is part of what makes it fun. And at that point, it's this unscripted, winding journey. We don't immediately plan an experiment. We often have no intention of publishing anything. We just want to understand. And so we're reaching out to different collaborators, different experts in areas. We're reading papers and topics that aren't related to ours. We're just trying to even figure out if we're asking the right question. And then sometimes this leads to discovery and innovation. Sometimes it doesn't. So today I want to talk about things from this perspective, a little bit more of storytelling, of how some of the science came to be, of things that sparked my own curiosity and kind of led me down a path. So this first story is about outrageous opportunities as it relates to wearable assistive technology. For those who don't know, I did not get my start in biomechanics. I started working in the field of cardiac bioelectricity. I was an undergrad, and I found a lab that was working on implantable pacemakers and defibrillators, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. I realized at the time that I had no experience and no real skills, so I went in very enthusiastically to the professor's office, and I said, look, I'm really interested in this topic, I'm a hard worker, and I can reach things off of high shelves. And he went for it, so that's how I got my start. And about 2.5 years I spent working on these pacemakers and defibrillators. I went out to the West Coast and for 6 months worked with one of the manufacturers of these implantable devices. Kind of by all accounts, it was like a dream job. I was in this mechanical design division for implantable pacemakers and defibrillators. But the truth is, my job was mostly to develop manufacturing tools. And then the really important job I served was to make sure nothing ever changed, because then they had to go back through the regulatory process. So meanwhile, there were these huge teams of software engineers who were doing all this really innovative work related to how do we monitor signals of the heart better, how do we shock the heart in just the right way. And I was kind of yearning for more, trying to figure out how can I also be a part of more innovative work. So I went back to, decided to go for a PhD program. Went to graduate school, went on a bunch of different visits, and one of them was to the University of Michigan. And I'm going around meeting with all the different faculty members. I walk into this laboratory, and there is Steve Collins walking around on a robotic prosthetic foot. I don't know if Peter Adamczyk is in the room, but he was tinkering on the workbench with another prosthesis. And I thought, this is cool. And I started talking to these guys, and I was hooked. I wanted to be a part of it. The biomechanics, the prosthetics, it was really interesting to me. And about 20 minutes into it, I popped up and I looked around, and I thought, whose lab is this? I didn't even know who was in charge of this lab. And they, of course, said, Art Quo. And I responded, who? I didn't know who he was. I didn't come from this field, and his website was 20 years out of date, so I actually didn't know he still worked in Michigan. So I met with Art and decided I think I can put up with this guy for about 5 years. And this kind of shaped my perspective on assistive technologies. So I'd say for the first several years of my career, prosthetics, I had this very kind of visceral and vivid connection to it, that I just became passionate about this idea that I wanted to work on science and technology that could help improve the lives of people with amputation. And I continue to share that passion. But in 2015, I had a major life event. My wife and I had our first child, my son Dex. He started out nice and small, like a football, easy to carry. But as kids do, he grew. And as he grew, he still liked to be held, picked up. We still played a lot together. And I noticed something else, which is a lot more back pain on my end. And so for as interested as I was in assistive technology for individuals with amputation and other disabilities, I started getting a little selfish. I thought about, what about me? What about some wearable tech for me to help offload my back? So I started looking around at different assistive technology solutions. And at the time, everything I found was effective, but not something that would fit into my daily life. These were either full body exoskeletons, which were too expensive for my wife to allow me to buy, or they were too bulky, maybe I couldn't sit down with them, they'd help me during certain tasks. But I really wanted something that would fit into my life as an adult. And as an adult with small kids, there's a lot of leaning over to help wash hands, getting in and out of cars, buckling car seats, playing, so I need flexibility and versatility and agility. And then of course I was trying to be an adult as well, so gardening and working on the house and things of that nature. And then in my professional life, of course, life as a professor, working in the lab, over the microscope. Okay, yeah, you know, that's not actually what professors do. But I mean, I do need to sit, right? So I mean, I sit, I type, I read things, I write things. Occasionally I get hungry for some data, I run down the hall to see what my grad students are up to. Yeah, so I had kind of exhausted the existing technology and decided to go back to the science. And up to this point, I had always been a lower limb biomechanics person. I'd never thought about anything trunk on up. But again, I was being a little bit selfish. I got interest because of my own personal life. And I started thinking about the science of the low back. And for anybody that works in this space, the back is insanely complex. So kudos to you, but I will say you can gain a lot of insight on the back just by thinking of it as a really simple lever system. So if you're holding up a child or another object and your spine is the fulcrum of this lever, then you have about half of your body weight sitting on your spine just from your head, arms, and trunk. However much the child weighs, there's some additional weight that's cantilevered out in front of you. And then the reason you don't fall on your face is because you contract your low back muscles in order to stabilize yourself. And so the cool insight is that if you actually look at this lever system, the vast majority of loading on your spine is actually self-inflicted. It's from your own muscles. And so we started thinking about, can we make technologies, devices that look more like clothing, where we, instead of routing all of the loading through the back muscles, can we route some of it through the clothing? And so we started infusing springs into clothes, and in a very simple sense, just looking at what type of effect would this have on the low back. So in a sense, we were trying to take all the things we liked about clothing, being lightweight and unobtrusive, and marry them with the things we liked about exoskeletons. So what's been neat about this is again, kind of going back to this as a personal life experience that then motivated me to move into a different research area. We've now launched a couple of different research projects in this space. We've recently spun off a company to try to commercialize some of this work. And I'm not going to be talking too much about the science, in part because Eric Lammers is going to be presenting a poster on this later today. So if you're interested in this technology and the effect it has on low back muscle fatigue, then please check out Eric's poster. But what I want to circle back around to is just that, again, this started as a selfish personal project. It didn't start from me reading the literature. It didn't start from me consciously saying, hey, I want to branch out into a new area. But as we got into it, we realized there were a lot of other applications, medical applications, industrial applications, military and defense applications. And this further motivated me to go and learn some more about some of these populations. I've been studying prosthetic users for a long time, but being able to sneak out of the ivory tower and go actually observe warehouses and operations, going into hospitals and clinics, and not just meeting with the patients or trying to understand the patients, but what's the wear and tear on the nurses that are taking care of the patients? What's the wear and tear on a surgeon who has to bend over for 10 hours while they're working? And this has been such an enriching experience and has changed my perspective on some of the challenges we face. It's changed my perspective on some of the ways we ask questions in the lab. In some cases, we approach the research very much from an injury prevention perspective, but you go out and you talk to people and you hear the fatigue, the wear and tear that's associated with some of these jobs, people that are working in a job in order to provide for their family, but the job is so physically demanding, they get home and they are literally too exhausted to spend any quality time with their family. And you start thinking, what could we do to help these folks? These are the folks that get packages to our doorstep. These are the folks that are working in many different infrastructure jobs. And the same with doctors and nurses. As you know, the constraints of technologies that we were to put in the clinic, what if it gets caught on a piece of equipment? What are the other constraints that we need to think about? So over the years, I guess 2008 to 2016, I would say was characterized by kind of my passion for assisting individuals with disabilities. And in retrospect, I would say I had kind of subconsciously keyed on disabilities that were current, obvious, and permanent. So amputation is an example of one, spinal cord injury is an example of one. But I started thinking about, what about non-obvious disabilities? So folks that may have multiple sclerosis, you may not notice every single day some of the challenges that are associated with that. Temporary disabilities. So you think about somebody that's maybe recovering from injury, trying to return to work or trying to return to sport. Or future non-obvious and temporary injuries. So as someone that was having acute back pain, that's an example. People that work in jobs that are at high risk for developing musculoskeletal injuries, right? There are things we can do in a preventative nature. And so what I see as the outrageous opportunity is I came in thinking really about prosthetics and the opportunity to help individuals. But as I've looked around, I realized a lot of the knowledge that we gain from prosthetics or exoskeletons, we can apply to so many other populations. There's other people in this room that may work on different niches within this assistive technology landscape, and I think you have knowledge that can almost certainly apply to some other area, and so that's the value I see in these conferences, is maybe recognizing some other opportunities where your skill set can carry over. And then for the students in the room, I will say every single year, the vast majority of students that I get that are interested in our work cite prosthetics as their #1 interest. And that's what got me involved in the field as well, so I think that's awesome. But hopefully part of what they're seeing here at this conference and other conferences is all the other opportunities where you can take some of these same challenges of augmenting human performance and human health. Okay, so my advice is, find ways to sneak out of the ivory tower, and I mean that across all levels, whether it's faculty, postdoc, students. It's really an enriching experience and will have an influence on how you do your work. And then the experiences outside of lab. I'm a big believer in work-life balance, so find a way to disconnect, and some of the coolest ideas and inspirations you'll find you're not going to find in articles or doing literature reviews, but just through your other hobbies and life interests. Okay, so how do we realize these outrageous opportunities, or as Paul DeVita says, become the 21st century breakthrough science? It's discovery, it's innovation, it's courage, but I think it's also curiosity and risk-taking and shameless stupidity, as I'll get to in a little bit. So the next story I want to tell is about precarious paradigms, which just means the things we think we know or that we think we understand, but may not be. And I'm going to tell this one from the standpoint of the 7 stages of grief that I went through over the deformable foot segment model. So this is kind of a typical progression people go through from shock all the way to acceptance after an event happens. So the backstory here is about 2010. And I'm at a conference not unlike this, enjoying the poster session. And my background, I was, as a graduate student, really interested in lower limb biomechanics, hip, knee, ankle, center of mass dynamics. And one of the kind of tenets in our field, one of the things that was very common was to look at this push-off phase, this burst of positive power at the end of walking. And this was considered to be important. There were theoretical models suggesting why push-off was important. There was experimental evidence suggesting why it was important in populations that had degraded amounts of push-off. We often tried to create technologies that would enhance their push-off capabilities. And so I would go and find all of the poster aisles that talked about lower limb biomechanics, and especially if it was talking about push-off, and I would go engage in those. And on this particular day, I had just completed the aisle that I would typically go through and viewed all the posters, and it was very busy, so I decided to cut around to the next aisle. And I wasn't really going there to see any of the science, but something caught my eye. And what caught my eye is I saw a poster where I saw this characteristic ankle push-off power. And so for simplicity in this story, ankle push-off is good. So if ankle push-off is good, things that detract from ankle push-off are bad. And so I saw this poster, and I saw this foot power, and it was going negative, absorbing energy at the same time that the ankle was generating the energy. And the energy doesn't seem to come back, so it's almost all negative at the end of stance. And this didn't make sense to me. and I saw that there was this discussion of deformable foot models, and it was different than the rigid body inverse dynamics that I was familiar with. And moreover, if you look at something like walking on sand, this curve I'm throwing up here now in gray, this is the power absorbed by walking on sand. So, if you've ever walked on sand, which I assume most of us have, it's fatiguing, it's more tiring, it's not something that you would consider good. It's detracting from your ability to walk economically. And so the foot was, in a sense, if I were to interpret this curve that way, the foot was detracting away from something that I thought was good. So my first reaction was, well, this is clearly wrong, right? It doesn't fit into my worldview. I'm not familiar with this, and plus I was one aisle over and nobody mentioned anything about that. So after I thought about it for a little bit, it was actually kind of upsetting because it was almost like the posters were back to back. On one side of the aisle, they were talking about ankle push-off being good, and on the other side, the foot's throwing away energy. Another thing we commonly encounter in biomechanics is we're kind of inspired by biology. It's very clever, it's smart. So why would the foot throw away energy like this? It didn't make any sense to me. So then came the bargaining. So about a year later, I was working on a prosthetic foot project. And this is a foot that had a separate heel component and a separate toe component, so they could move independently. And if we applied a standard biomechanics gait analysis marker set, we could capture the toe motion, but we'd miss everything that's happening in the heel. So we knew there was going to be a bunch of energy that was stored in springs that we were just missing. And we thought, well, this deformable foot model might actually not be a terrible idea in this case. And I won't say that I was fully excited about the model, but it didn't seem wrong. And when we did some sanity checks and tested what it captured, so at the very beginning of stance, there's this negative power right between about 0 and 20% stance phase. It was capturing energy that we expected to see. It was doing what we, it passed all the litmus tests, and it didn't seem wrong at the time. And so we used it, and it was quite effective for our purposes. But it's still in the back of my head bothered me that when I went back to the biological limb, and I, for instance, added up all the work that was done by the hip, the knee, the ankle, and the foot, and I compared that to the whole body change in energy, there was a mismatch. And essentially what this mismatch means is we look at the body and we know that the body's increasing its kinetic energy by a certain amount, but we can't point to where in the body that energy was coming from. About a third of the work was just missing. And around this time, I had actually at this point started a postdoc over in Italy, and I was working in a different field related to neuromotor control. But my wife said, at some point you need to grow up and get a real job. And I thought I was able to kind of stay in the postdoc focused research phase forever, but she said, you got to go and do something else. This postdoc has only got a set period of time. So I said, all right, let me make some calls, and I called up Greg Sawicki to ask him, what's it like to be a professor? What's the professor life about? What do you like? What do you dislike? And at the end of that conversation, we started talking about some science. And so what was cool here is that ended up leading to a collaboration with Greg and Kota Takahashi and myself, where we were able to change some of the methods related to how we compute power at the different joints and discover that actually we could reconcile all of this deformable foot stuff with our traditional ankle and foot power estimates. So I'm not going to go into this. There's a paper citation at the bottom that talks about this particular study. And then over the next few years, a graduate student of mine named Eric Honertz, this is after I'd started a faculty position at Vanderbilt, kind of joined me in further looking into this. We dove deeper into some of the analytical derivations and did some more studies that kind of fully brought me in to accept the value and correctness of these deformable foot estimates. So again, rather than get into the details, I'll kind of point to a couple of papers that outline additional evidence that ultimately convinced me. But what I want to summarize is more on the side of the fact that it took me 8 years from kind of the initial shock of something that didn't make sense, that piqued my curiosity, to when I kind of fully accepted it, understood that there was enough evidence, converging evidence, that these methods made sense, and they actually improved our interpretation of biomechanics. So one example is if you look at barefoot walking, and the blue curve shows what you get if you apply these kind of updated estimates of ankle power, which take into account the foot deformation. The green line shows what you get if you apply traditional ankle power, and what we find and what we found across literature from other groups as well is about a 20 to 80% overestimate in ankle power if you use these traditional models. So kind of right away, if we're looking at how much power do we need to generate with a prosthesis, I want to say learn from the biological limb. This is already impacting how I think about designing assistive tech, and it influences how we conduct experiments. And likewise, if we're evaluating different prosthetic feet, we found the same sort of thing, which is if you use one method, the traditional method, you may conclude that prosthetic foot A is generating more power than prosthetic foot B, but if you relax that rigid body assumption and are able to capture all the power, you can actually come to the exact opposite conclusion. So the quick scientific conclusion is that we should quit being so rigid and stop modeling the entire foot as a rigid body. But what I really want to focus on is kind of the higher level takeaways, which is to encourage people not to stay in your lane, which I mean literally when you go to the posters, go check out some other areas that you wouldn't normally check out, and you may encounter something that bothers you for the next 8 years. And then also figuratively just explore outside of your area. I think it's easy to get so much momentum in one space, but embrace the chaos and confusion that comes with exploring a new area. Okay, so the last story I want to talk about is Shameless Stupidity. To be very clear, I'm talking about my own stupidity in this particular case. So I think this is a really powerful tool that if you can recognize when you really don't understand something. And it's uncomfortable here. There's a ton of really smart people in the room. People explain things. It seems like everyone else understands it. And at some point you just don't. And you see a lot of head nodding and you think, oh, everybody understands it. But I think the ability to just really admit, I don't understand what's being said. I can approach somebody and either they can give me some more resources so I can understand, or is it possible that there are assumptions or ideas that are built into what they're talking about that maybe even they don't see. And so I love this idea of shameless stupidity and just saying, I don't get it. So this story starts out, an orthopedic doctor at Vanderbilt approached us and asked a seemingly simple question. He has a clinic. He sees a lot of runners come in every week with stress fractures. And he said, look, could I use wearable technology in some way to monitor these runners and help prevent stress fractures? And I thought, biomechanics to the rescue. We can definitely do this. And then I started thinking about it and I thought, we can almost certainly do this. We can probably do this. Let me get back to you. And so he and I, we just started meeting and hanging out. We'd sit around and discuss some journal articles, him coming from the clinical side, myself coming from the biomechanics side. And at some point, two of my students, Emily and Lauren, caught wind of this, and they said, yeah, we're getting in on that. So we had no plans to write a publication. We had no plans to do anything. It was just curiosity. It was of interest. And so we spent a year just reviewing the literature, reading documents, discussing them, reading articles, learning about the wearable tech that was on the market, how people were thinking about injuries, what types of metrics they were recording with IMU sensors or with pressure insoles. And a couple common themes emerged in the literature. One was that we saw over 50 publications a year that would either assume or report or interpret the results in the context of basically higher ground reaction forces under the feet, or higher loading rates of those ground reaction forces were associated with higher injury risks for runners. And then as far as we could tell, every wearable device on the market that reported some kind of injury metric was based on this kind of fundamental understanding. And the truth was, I just didn't understand it. I saw these statements being made in literature. I didn't see the kind of logic or the evidence that connected from one to the other. And if anyone was at Ben O'Nigg's tutorial before this conference, he spent about 30 or 45 minutes talking through this evidence, so that was excellent. It means I don't have to cover it. But I'll give kind of an example so you can see a little bit of my thinking. But the basic takeaway is just that I felt confused. I felt like I didn't understand it, and I wanted to. So the example that I think helps me think through this is basically, if you look at the force over the stance phase of running, this is the ground reaction force. There's often this little impact peak that happens early in stance right after your foot hits the ground. And and then it progresses into what's called the active peak over mid-stance. And in this particular case, we were really interested in stress fractures of the tibia. This is one of the most common places that runners develop stress fractures. And we started thinking about, well, what's the relationship between the loading under your foot, the ground reaction force, and the tibia force, and it looks like this. And so what I had trouble jumping between is all of this focus on the small ground reaction force in the beginning of that phase, the impact, when actually most of the loading on the tibia was occurring because of the contraction of the calf muscles during mid-stance. So after a year of study, we ended up running an experiment of our own where we said, okay, well, we know the magnitudes are wildly different, but what if every time the tibia load goes up, our ground reaction force metrics also go up? And every time it goes down, the ground reaction force metric goes down. It could still be a useful surrogate. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. So we asked this question of, do changes in ground reaction force metrics indicate changes in tibial forces? And the very quick answer is no. We did not find that they did. This is an example where we used loading rate and just linearly scaled it so that it's on the same scale as the tibia force. But basically, we found a huge amount of variability, that there was no strong correlation or relationship. And if you're interested in this topic, we have a pretty extended discussion of this and all the results in this PLOS One paper that came out earlier this year. But what I took away from this was really that there seemed to be a lot of gaps and misconceptions in the literature related to, in part, our intuition. When we all run, we feel when our foot hits the ground, so it feels like these are large loads. But with respect to what the bones are actually feeling, the loading at early stance is very small compared to the loading your bones feel later on. There was a really nice summary put together by Ross Miller, where he looked across about 15 or so different papers. This is the epidemiological evidence looking at do people with higher loading rates, does that have an effect on injury outcomes? And what you see on the top right is that a few papers found higher rates or higher loading rates in the injured group. Many papers found no difference, then a few found exactly the opposite, which is higher loading rates in actually the uninjured. And at the bottom, there's some summary metrics that show for both retrospective and prospective studies that there's doesn't seem to be a consistent effect. And so I think this is one of the challenges in literature is in many cases there seems to be kind of selectively citing certain studies that support an idea, but I think it's really beneficial to be able to look across the breadth of the literature and understand what the current state of the evidence is. And then last, I'm not going to get into this, but in the paper we talk a lot about bone mechanics. So from a material science perspective, how does loading induce micro damage, which eventually accumulates into these stress fractures? And the way that this is discussed and the ideas and evidence in the bone mechanics community in some cases seems pretty divergent from how sports science, exercise science, and biomechanics are using this information. So and then the last thing is just that a lot of these wearable technologies are built on this scientific evidence that, again, seems to have a lot of gaps and misconceptions in it. So I saw this as an opportunity. We started as just an interest and a curiosity, but I like to think my shameless stupidity of just saying I don't get it led us in the direction of launching a new research direction in our lab. And I think there's a lot of really interesting science related to trying to reconcile some of these different fields, material science, to bone mechanics, musculoskeletal biomechanics, and epidemiology, and then thinking, can we get outside of the lab and actually create wearable sensors that can more directly measure the loading on tissues inside the body? And if you're interested in this topic, my graduate student Emily will be giving a talk later today at 12:20. She gave this talk at the Footwear Biomechanics Symposium right before this conference and won an award for the talk. So it's a really good talk, really promising information, and this is kind of a sneak peek at current state of the art versus some new algorithms we think we can use to estimate loading on bones inside the body using non-invasive sensors. So the big takeaways here are basically don't be afraid to be stupid. Don't be afraid to say I don't get it. You're either going to learn something new because somebody's going to explain it to you, or you might stumble across something that opens up some opportunities for new research. And I think that some problems require experience, and other times it's just fresh eyes and fresh voices, and I think that's a lot of fun. So again, encouraging people to get outside their comfort zone. Okay, is there time left? The answer is no, so we jump to the big finish. Actually, I'll still flip through just in case people are interested in chatting about this stuff afterwards. Some other things, so the other shameless stupidity, things I don't understand right now and would like to understand. In prosthetics in particular, why are we so focused on doing group level analysis when there seems to be so much heterogeneity in how people respond? What is this one about? Oh, pet prosthetics. This is just fun. So this is basically a lesson in, we spend a lot of time thinking about the end effector, but it turned out when we tried to make some little puppy prosthetics, basically the only thing that mattered was the physical interface. And so we've been thinking a lot more about how we interface with the body and making sure that foundation is solid. We spent a lot of time talking about metabolic cost reductions, particularly in prosthetics, but you know, when you talk to folks, often they're more worried about falling down, and so we have some work related to just different outcomes, different paradigms for studying these, and some of the students in my group have already talked about some toe dynamics. So let me just get to the end. The big takeaways, just to review, I encourage people to sneak out of the ivory tower, use your experiences outside of work in order to broaden and enhance your research. Don't stay in your lane, go check out other posters and embrace the chaos and confusion that is science. And don't be afraid to be stupid and say, I don't get it, because some problems just require fresh eyes. And I think in order to innovate, sometimes we just need to gain some new perspective. And sometimes the best way to sell beer is with goats. Thanks. I think do we have a bit of time? We have 9-10 minutes for questions, discussion.
I'll ask a quick question to get started. You mentioned the 7 stages of grief, and we spent some time together. Where are you in those stages with the theory that center of mass work rate has a tight correlation with metabolic energy?
So the question was, along the 7 stages of grief, so it seems like a bit of a presumptuous question that I am in grief over that. Where am I with respect to the relationship between, is it center of mass push-off and metabolic cost?
Center of mass work rate and metabolic cost.
I have to remember what the stages are. I think that there's for me, a pretty big disconnection between the two, except in very controlled circumstances where if you have a set of conditions where you're able to control enough, and that's one of the only things that's changing, then it may end up being a good predictor of metabolic cost. I don't know that I'm along the scale. I don't know that I'm having any grief over that. Yes?
I like your thoughts about how we report science is not the way it actually unfolds. And I've thought a lot about that too. And do you have thoughts about, or anybody have thoughts about formally documenting that kind of process, the discovery process to help? Because I think even knowing, where you failed, if you don't report that, because we don't want to report that can help other people.
Yeah. All right, so that's a great question. I think that conferences are a great place to do that. And if you stick around for the next session, we have 4 fantastic speakers who are going to talk on exactly that topic. All the things they failed at, the lessons they learned. The reality is if you don't have, most of us at this conference, you have a poster, maybe you have 8 minutes to present information. We often don't have time to do this. I had 30 minutes to kind of talk through some of the background, so that was great. I'm really glad I was able to do that. I'm glad that the next speakers were game for doing the same, of sharing some of that insight. But a lot of this is, you have to take the very targeted, specific approach. You need to be concise. And so I don't know, I'd love to see occasionally at conferences little bits of this, and hopefully at least students hear this, because I know when I was a student looking up, it just seemed like everyone had their act together. Everyone knew exactly what they were doing. And I think that's about as far from the truth as it could be. But that's what we're doing. We're supposed to be at the bleeding edge of not knowing what we're doing and then figuring it out.
So Carl, you and I have had some good conversations over the years about our ADD nature when it comes to research. And I want to know, can you give some advice to the younger faculty about how do you stay interested in everything, but also get tenure?
I don't have tenure. I can't speak to that. I don't I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I have seen some folks that have done phenomenal research in a targeted area. They're passionate about it, and they are the best at what they do, and continue to do excellent, inspiring research. And then I also see folks like ourselves who, you see something over here, somebody asks a question, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go ahead over and check that out. And I think that both ways can be successful. I think it's up to each person to decide what they want to do, how broad they want to be, and I think in either case there's risks if you become either way too narrow or if you broaden out too much. At the end of the day, you've got to get the funds and support to do the research, and you've got to be able to kind of maintain the research enterprise. So I've seen people do the broad spectrum. Yeah.
So what are you learning from the goats as you start to commercialize and translate your back technology?
So the question, what am I learning from the goats, from getting outside the lab?
Or from the beer and the goats as you start to do something similar with your back technology?
I see. I mean, I think the goats to me are just a reminder that sometimes we become so good at looking at a problem from one perspective. And then I think Walter might have even mentioned this at the very beginning of the conference. Somebody says something that makes you rethink where your starting point is. And I think that's happening a lot on the research side for me is realizing, oh, I've been trying this for a while, but then somebody broadens my perspective, and I start saying, oh, well, there's this other set of solutions we've never even explored before. In terms of getting outside the lab, it's mostly what I was saying with, I think from the academic literature or from the funding side of things, we often approach things from injuries and health perspective, and that's really important, but it's not the only important thing. And oftentimes when I'm either observing people or talking to people out in the field, it seems like health is an important long-term issue, but there's a lot of pressing short-term issues as well. And just being cognizant of them. One specific example is we ran a follow-up study on our low back exosuit to look at how it affected muscle fatigue. And the reason we did that is because industry said fatigue is a problem, fatigue is important to us. Before that, we had only been looking at the magnitude of muscle activity to try to understand if we were reducing loading in the thinking that that would help reduce the likelihood of overuse injuries. So that's just an example where it ends up being a different experiment and a different question. They're complementary, but it's just kind of opened my eyes to other ways to ask the question. Thanks. Yeah.
I've been to 2 talks with viewers so far. First time was in walking last week. And so for the first 5 minutes, I thought I was in the wrong room. So I'm feeling here with the same for a lot of people who don't know. The question is about the tibial stress. How do you calculate it in the first place? Did you have like musculoskeletal?
Yeah, the tibial stress work is one where we basically used lab-based data in order to estimate the compressive loading on the tibia bone. So we used a simplified musculoskeletal model. There's some really interesting literature out there that's actually compared a musculoskeletal model with, I can't remember, a very small number of muscles, either 4 muscles or 1 composite calf muscle, to a really complicated, I think 300 muscle open sim musculoskeletal model, and the estimates came out to be within about 5%. So the tibia bone happens to be one where whether you're doing a really complex model or a really simple one, it tends to give a very similar solution in terms of compressive tibia load during running. The back, unfortunately, is not quite as simple, so that's another project we're working on, trying to do the same thing, but that's where the model is more sensitive to, or the results are more sensitive to the model selection. And thanks for the comments.
That's all the time we're going to have. They're going to be splitting this